So I just want to thank Am for that delightfully kind introduction. I'd also like to begin my talk here today with a statement of gratitude to and political acknowledgement of the Indigenous caretakers of this land. This area is rich in the theory and practice of Indigenous internationalism, political alliance, and mobilization, which will be the center of my talk today, holding the histories and presence of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. These nations continue to practice diplomatic relationships with each other to share the land while respecting each other's overlapping governance, jurisdiction, and nested sovereignties. Each nation also exists in a deep reciprocal relationship with not only the land, but the ocean and the magnificent waterways that flow from and into it, but also all of the physical and spiritual forces that connect them to this place, their place of creation in an intimate and meaningful way. So I just want to start by saying Masi Cho to these nations for their continued presence, their hospitality, and more importantly, their militant pervasiveness. So what I want to do today is just kind of set up this talk. It is kind of in retrospect and thinking about it, a very cursory sort of historical and theoretical sketch of a new book or series of books that I'm working on, which I had decided to actually split into two. So it's kind of, in the way that I've been thinking about it lately, a prequel, I guess, to Red Skin, White Masks, something that I wish I had covered in it a little bit more thoroughly in order to look at the intersections between red and black nationalisms that form the critique that I offer of a liberal politics of recognition through Fanon, the Dene, and others in my first book. And then through to the second half of the book will be the foundations, or the Fourth World foundations, of a critique of settler political economy, which draws on this kind of the theoretical and movement and solidarity insights gleaned from this preliminary work that I'll share with you for about 40 minutes today. Please also excuse me, I'm a little bit under the weather, so I may be sniffling through this whole thing as well. So in their foundational co-edited volume, Theorizing Native Studies, Audra Simpson and Andrea Smith identify several fundamental concerns raised by some Indigenous studies scholars regarding the heightened interest in substantively engaging non-Indigenous political theory within our field. In particular, they write, and I'll quote at length, "Theory is often positioned as the opposite of other concepts considered more important, such as theory versus practice, theory versus community-based scholarship, theory versus truth, and theory versus political engagement. Suspicion about the turn towards theory in Native studies also remains. It is not uncommon to hear, and I've heard this a lot, the complaint within venues within Native studies that theoretical projects are inherently Western, are non-Indigenous, and spoil the possibility of scholarly production outside of the confines of intellectual traditions that have been used to uphold and contextualize forms of defining difference and thus dominating that which is and still defined as different. As such, theoretical projects are often accused of being insufficiently grounded in the needs of Native communities. These concerns, I would suggest, force us to ask what role non-Indigenous political or social thought ought to play in articulating our struggles for decolonization. And when these outside traditions are taken up in any depth, to what extent does this reproduce power asymmetries in the discursive and non-discursive economy that have been so destructive to the Indigenous modes of thought and critical inquiry that inform our perspectives, not to mention the land in which these normative frameworks are embedded? If such an indictment of theory is plausible in general, then some would think that it would be even more so from the perspective of place-based theories of Indigenous resurgence. Resurgence, after all, is a purposefully inward project. It calls on Indigenous peoples and communities to seek reprieve from the corrosive influence of colonial discursive formations and sites of non-Indigenous knowledge production through the autonomous and transformational reconstruction of Indigenous epistemologies, political structures, and land-connected economic practices. For Leanne Simpson, decolonization thus requires that we reorient our individual and collective struggle from attempts to transform what she poetically refers to as the colonial outside into a flourishment of the colonial inside. We need to decolonize on our own terms, she continues, without the sanction, permission, or engagement of the state, Western theory, or the opinions of Canadians. Now, in my talk, I explore the historical cross-fertilization between third and fourth world social and political thought, with a particular but not exclusive emphasis on the work of Frantz Fanon. I do so with the intent to sketch out a more theoretically promiscuous view of resurgence, to borrow again from Audra and Andy's provocative phrase, one that historically has been self-consciously open, yet still critical about the political and theoretical source of its influences. Here I use the third and fourth world, similar to how Vijay Prashad deploys the former in the darker nations. That is, as explicitly political projects, oppositionally aligned against colonialism and imperialism in ways that evade racial and cultural essentialisms on the one hand, while still grounding one's theoretical and political adaptations in the diverse material specificities of land, place, and culture on the other. Now, in exploring these cross-fertilizations, however, I intend to challenge the still common assumption that this theoretical openness somehow equates or suggests assimilation, and therefore represents and or serves in the discursive erasure of indigenous thought and intellectual traditions. Instead, I argue that resurgence, namely the attempted individual and collective decolonization of indigenous nations and nationalisms through acts of militant cultural self-actualization, has always been an intellectually polymorphous project, informed but not straitjacketed by the grounded normativities of place. I'm just going to show some pictures as we go, just in case you get bored. So this is a vote for the Dene Declaration, which I speak of, that was unanimously passed in 1975. So when I first began to conduct research on the Dene Nation's struggle for self-determination approaching 2 decades ago, it became immediately apparent to me that our leaders saw our decolonization efforts as necessarily linked to the struggles of colonized peoples elsewhere, both internationally but also domestically. Indeed, the Dene Nation was explicit about these connections. Consider the following statement written into the original first draft of the Declaration of 1975, which was pages and pages long. The final punchy draft that was provided for the media was only 2 pages. It states unequivocally, and I'll again quote at length, that there are many lessons for the Dene to learn from the development of the third world countries. As colonies of the imperial powers, they everywhere failed to develop. Their prospects necessarily improved to the extent that they were successful in gaining independence, but even after formal political independence, many have had trouble developing because of the power of the so-called multinational corporations, with their base in a small number of highly developed industrial societies, which have denied their genuine economic independence. Only with tremendous effort from the people can an economy independent from outside control be built. Our situation in the North is similar to that of the peoples of the Third World, who were until very recently still subjugated. I'm just going to drink my wine as we go along here. It's my birthday liberty. The draft of the Declaration ends with 2 appendices. One outlining a, quote, declaration on development, proposing an alternative mixed economy privileging a contemporary Dene bush mode of production on the one hand, and in cases where the nation decided to foray into industrial activity, the democratization of production and economic distribution through worker-owned and operated enterprises, and a ban on private property on the other. One of the outside inspirations of the Dene approach to indigenous economic development was the model offered at the time by Tanzania, based as it was on the twin concepts of socialism and self-reliance. I'll have more to say about the Tanzanian connection and where it came from later. The second appendix concerns strategy and includes recognition that the Dene face enemies from both within and without. The former being the result of the internalized colonialism that has caused us to, quote, turn against our own. Now, I just recently, or fairly recently, came across this draft declaration while carrying out some archival work on this book, and when looked at through a contemporary lens, it really makes sense to me. Formal independence occurring simultaneously with economic subjugation, enemies from within and without spawn from and reproduce through an internalization of one's colonial alienation and subjecthood, centering the land alongside the city as a necessary site of revolutionary agency and struggle. All of these concepts, I suggest, were formulated in conversation with the Third World theorizing of the lights of Memmi, Nyerere, Mao, Nkrumah, and of course, Fanon. In turning to these theorists, we were not, however, as our critics of the day suggested, simply brainwashed by the left-wing consultants duped our left-wing consultants, or duped by a youthful fascination with third world communism. We were instead engaging in a global anti-imperialist dialogue that had well-established roots among radicals of all stripes in Canada in the 1960s and 70s. Fanon in particular was a central, albeit very controversial figure in these overlapping conversations. Now, Fanon's impact in North America, especially in the United States, has been well documented by many scholars. In particular, Fanon's writings on colonial racism and national liberation left a deep imprint on the black and brown liberation movements of the 1960s. One can read both explicit and implicit traces of Fanon's thought, for example, in the writings of Malcolm X, of Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver of the Black Panther Party, and in the work of Liberator editor Daniel Watts, who was once famously quoted as saying that at the heyday of the Black Power movement, quote, every brother on a rooftop could quote Fanon. In the US Academy, Fanon has been equally as influential, with his work remaining relatively consistent in terms of its presence, if not its form and content, from the 80s until today. Those influences here include the work of foundational black and radical feminists like Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, in the political theory of the late, great Cedric Robinson, and of course more contentiously within the US-based home of the field of post-colonial studies. And of course, the list could go on and on. We have also seen, gratefully, a more recent upsurge in Fanon's work following the insurrectory organizing and knowledge production associated with Black Lives Matter. Indeed, in the flurry of activism following the NYPD chokehold murder of Eric Garner on July 17, 2014, Fanon seemed to have gained the revolutionary icon status previously reserved for the likes of only Che Guevara, with his prophetic words regularly turning up on social media and in the streets on protest signs. When we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. The profound mark that Fanon has left on US anti-imperialism and anti-racism from the 60s to the present led Stuart Hall to once declare the Wretched of the Earth as nothing less than the Bible of Decolonization. Now, due to time constraints, I will have to skip over the first section of this paper from which it's crafted. There I offer an interrogation of the reception and application of Fanon's theoretical work in largely non-native and in many cases white political thought and activism in Canada from the 60s to the present. In short, I suggest that Fanon's influence is at least as pronounced as it was in the US, although his uptake was fraught with far more contradictions and has been decidedly less discussed in the secondary literature on Fanon. For instance, just to give you a taste, white Quebec sovereigntists in the 1960s often borrowed the language of Fanonian anti-colonialism in their own struggles for national recognition, while largely ignoring Fanon's insights into the problem of recognition in colonial contexts, and of course Quebec's own problematic status as a white settler colony founded on the theft and attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples on the other. To complicate matters further, Fanon's work was also used by high-level Canadian Federalists, even the forthcoming Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, to critique Quebecois nationalism, and then later by multiculturalists like Charles Taylor to chart a conciliatory path between the self-determination claims of Quebec and the concerns of Canada over national unity. And then finally, and more directly on point, was the use of Fanon, among other Third World theorists, to critique racism and anti-blackness of both Quebec and English Canada, both materially and on the grounds and ideologically in their use of racial metaphors to work through their own deep-seated white colonial anxieties, whether from the federalist, sovereigntist, or later multiculturalist vantage points. The most famous here being the notion that Québécois constituted a nègre blanc, articulated most clearly in Pierre Vallier's 1968 White Niggers of America, which he wrote from prison. As David Austin meticulously demonstrates, the 1960s has a rich black radical tradition that challenged and exposed these contradictions through the organizing of major gatherings like the 1968 Congress of Black Writers, which included participation from the likes of C.L.R. James, Stokely Carmichael, and Halifax-based activist Rocky Jones, and in militant direct actions like the so-called Sir George Williams Affair in 1969. It's a truly fascinating story, these cross-fertilizations, complicated albeit, which I'd be happy to talk about more during the Q&A. Now, what I do want to take a little bit of time to do today is look at the stamp that Fanon and other Third World theorists had on the intellectual output of Indigenous scholars and activists in Canada. Out of all Red Power activists, Fanon's influence was most influential in the written work of the late Métis historian Howard Adams. According to Adams' own account, he was first introduced to the literature of the Black Power movement, particularly Malcolm X and Eldridge Cleaver, and in the writings of Third World anti-colonialists. Here, Nkrumah, Memi, and Fanon pop out, while he was a graduate student at Berkeley during the turbulent decade of 1960s radical student activism. This experience would significantly shape the theoretical and historical analyses that Adams develops in his two major political works. His 1975 text, Prison of Grass, Canadian from a Native Point of View, and his 1995 follow-up, A Tortured People, The Politics of Colonization. In both of these texts, Adams applies Fanon's insights into the nature of internalized colonialism to show how colonization is able to secure its dominance over native lands and bodies by warping the behavior and self-image of colonized subjects in ways that make our dispossession and political subjugation appear as an appropriate response to our perceived cultural inferiority and backwardness. Like Fanon, the foundation of Adams' work rests on the lived experience of being a colonized native, a Métis who, quote, had witnessed the forces of colonization in all of its dimensions. Adams' point of departure in both Prison of Grass and Tortured People is thus autobiographical, resulting in an at times excruciating portrayal, phenomenological portrayal of his encounter with anti-native racism and the crushing poverty of rural Métis life. In recounting his childhood experience of growing up in what he calls a, quote, half-breed ghetto in a world, quote, divided in two, to explicitly borrow Fanon's Manichaean terminology, Adams vividly depicts the effects of internalized violence on his own personal and intellectual development. As insightful as Adams was with respect to mapping the interiority of externally imposed structural conditions, especially regarding the violent confluence of race, class, and state power in the reproduction of settler colonial social formations, he was virtually silent with respect to how gender fit into this question. Enter the foundational work of Stalo feminist, novelist, poet, and activist Lee Maracle. Maracle, whom many of you are familiar with. Her first book, 1975's autobiographical Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel, traces her political awakening and radicalization from her involvement in the 1960s counterculture of Yorkville's hippie scene, through her time spent opposing the Vietnam War with Trotskyist anti-war activists in downtown Toronto, to its culmination in her co-founding with then-partner Ray Bob, the militant inter-city Vancouver-based activist organization Native Alliance for Red Power. Sorry. As insightful as that, NARP was established in 1967 in response to a rape and murder case in Williams Lake, British Columbia by 3 controversially acquitted white men. Predating both the formation of the American Indian movement in 1968 and the famous Alcatraz occupation of 1969 through 1971, NARP drew their inspiration from a combination of indigenous tradition, third world liberation, and the 10-point platform of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. As a result, most influential in terms of outside theoretical contributions to NARP's revolutionary platform was the critical interpretation and adaptation of Marx by Mao and Fanon, which NARP familiarized themselves through the formation of the Native Study Group in 1971, which also had a chapter in the Bay Area headed by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Ortiz was also a friend and colleague of Howard Adams, which is not incidental here, as they worked together at UC Davis in their early Indigenous Studies program. According to Bob, NSG's mandate was to create, quote, theory at the level whereby an organization could be formed to do consciously revolutionary work. The goal of the NSG was thus to combine theory with revolutionary practice, including the formation of material relationships of support and solidarity with the colonized both home and abroad. NARP's commitment to synthesizing theory and practice of solidarity between the third and fourth worlds culminated in a 1975 delegation of NSG members to the People's Republic of China, which they titled the Native People's Friendship Delegation. Like his significance to the black radical nationalists in the US, Mao's influence on indigenous nationalists like Ray Bob was based on his insistence, or this is I'm speculating, that the landed peasantry constitute revolutionary actors in their own right and not merely in proximity to the urban proletariat, that revolutionary conditions can and should be created through direct action not dependent on the historical unfolding of so-called objective material conditions, that cultural struggle is as significant to revolution as struggle in the political and/or economic sphere, and to quote from historian Robin Kelly in the context of Mao's influence on black nationalism, that, quote, Marxism can and must be shaped to the requirements of time and place, and that practical work, ideas, and leadership stem from the masses and movement, not from theory created in the abstract. It's also important to note here that NARP's delegation to the People's Republic of China carried on a tradition of such travel within the black radical tradition, including W.E.B. Du Bois prior to the Cultural Revolution in 1936, and then again in 1959, where he spent his 90th birthday, and by revolutionaries in the Black Panther Party, including Elaine Brown and Huey Newton between 1970 and 71. It's also important, in 1971, Jorge Manuel was attempting to establish a convoy to the People's Republic as well, which I don't talk about here, but I'll get to Manuel's influence soon. So what Miracle-specific work with NARP and the NSG does during this period better than no other is foregrounds the explicitly misogynist character of historical policies of land dispossession and assimilation by highlighting the ways in which this legacy of sexist misrecognition under the Indian Act continues to inform our present struggles for national liberation. Here, Fanon's influence is again explicit. As she writes with respect to her radicalization in Bobby Lee, Indian rebel, quote, what interested me was the thinking of Fanon, particularly his ideas of native settler relationships and the connections between colonialism and neocolonialism. The psychoaffective dimension of neocolonialism continues as a prominent theme in Miracle's work to this day. Quote, when the chains are bound to you by internal attitudes and beliefs created by external world conditions, writes Miracle in her masterful I Am Woman, again echoing Fanon, removing them is both painful and humbling. Sexism, racism, and the total dismissal of Native women's experience has little to do with who does the dishes and who minds the babies, she continues. These oppressions result from the colonial accumulation of hurt sustained by our peoples over long periods of time. If the influence of so-called third world theory arrived in the 1960s via Montreal and Martinique and onto the Canadian prairies via Howard Adams, and Berkeley, I suggest that it arrived on my own territory in the north through the Dene Nation's working relationship with Secwepemc leader and indigenous internationalist Jorge Manuel. There is ample evidence to support this claim. For one, Manuel was a strong supporter of the Dene Nation's land struggle and worked tirelessly with our leadership to promote our bid for self-determination, as demonstrated in the pages of testimony that he gave in Yellowknife at the public hearings of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline inquiry in 1976. He was also supposed to attend the vote for the Dene Declaration in 1975, and he was actually in Yellowknife, as documented in Peter McFarlane's important biography, but had heart troubles on his way, so he had to go back to Yellowknife and did never make it for that vote. As stated in that testimony, the testimony he gave to the Berger inquiry, Manuel saw the Dene as part of what he would come to champion as the Fourth World, a phrase he first came across at an international gathering of diplomats from Tanzania and a number of other non-aligned African countries in the early 1970s. Indeed, Manuel's African ties were extensive, in large part due to the network of African anti-imperialists introduced to him by his core political advisor in the National Indian Brotherhood at the time, Blackfoot scholar and activist Maurice Smallface Marula. That's her. After completing her undergraduate degree in anthropology and sociology at the University of Alberta in 1968, one of the first in her community to do so, Smallface Marula signed up with the Canadian University Service Overseas, or CUSO, to do some work in Africa. This landed her in Zambia's capital city of Lusaka, which at the time was a major center of anti-colonial militancy in Africa. Like Tanzania and Nyerere to the north, Zambia was a defender of a homegrown African socialism that maintained an internationalist position that supported decolonization and black liberation across the continent and indeed in the world. During this time, she made numerous local contacts, including her eventual life partner, militant member of the African National Congress, Jacob Marula. Upon her return to Canada, Cree leader Harold Cardinal recommended Smallface Marula for a position in Manuel's National Indian Brotherhood, a working relationship that would significantly shape Manuel's internationalism for years to come. In 1971, Manuel traveled to Tanzania as part of a Canadian delegation of diplomats invited to attend the commemoration of Tanzania's 10-year anniversary since its independence, and as the story goes, was hosted by local politicians, including Julius Nyerere himself, as one of Canada's head representatives after then Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, Jean Chrétien, was forced to cancel his visit, unrelated, at the last minute. The space for Manuel was advocated hard by Smallface Marula, who had extensive Tanzania contacts in the High Commission. The access that this combination of circumstances enabled provided Manuel with a rare opportunity to engage in lengthy conversations with President Nyerere and other key government ministers about their respective colonial experiences and what a genuinely post-colonial form of economic and social development might look like, one that didn't, as Fanon insisted, take its cues from mimicking European models. As Manuel states in his foundational The Fourth World, an Indian Reality, quote, as all the models of economic development or in social development I have seen, Tanzania is the closest example to my understanding of the way that Indian people might develop. Tanzania is such a good example of the difference between the third and fourth world because neither the people nor their leaders have been content to produce a new society that is merely a darker imitation of the world of their colonial masters. Now, when the Dene Declaration was made in 1975, the predominant response was negative. As I discuss in my book, then Minister of Indian Affairs, Judge Buchanan, dismissed the declaration as, quote, gobbledygook, that a grade 10 student could have written in 15 minutes. Even respected Cree leader Harold Cardinal condemned the declaration at the time as a, quote, intrusion of left-wing thinking that is perhaps much closer to the academic community in Toronto than it is to the Dene. Much of the criticism leveled at the Dene Nation during this time expressed a similar sentiment, namely that the Dene leadership had been manipulated by the theoretical and practical influence of outside agitators and were therefore not acting in the interests of their own people. This assumption extended to the writing of the Declaration itself, which at the time was believed by many non-natives to be drafted by one of the Dene Nation's non-native consultants, Peter Puxley, based on his adaptation of Tanzania's Arusha Declaration of 1969. The thrust of the argument here again being that these cross-fertilizations could not have been grounded in Dene values and interests, but had come from the ideological influence of outsiders. Nothing could be further from the truth, and I'm kind of panicking right now because I have my last page. So I'm going to have to move to my bag here and find something. Nothing could be further from the truth, as demonstrated in an April 14, 1975 letter between a representative of the Ganawage, sub-office of the Indians of Quebec Association, who at the time was Jorge Manuel's son, the recently deceased activist extraordinaire, Arthur Manuel, and then vice president of the Dene, which at the time was Richard Nirasu. What they were doing in that letter, or in that exchange between the Dene, Tanzania, and the Quebec Association of Indians, was establish a field workers program where Dene militant research activists along with Mohawks would go over in this student exchange to learn from people's post-colonial development in Africa. Which is fine. Actually, I will do that. So this influence didn't only extend materially in those offerings and the attempted to work out these relationships of solidarity through this traveling, the dissemination of idea and bodies over time and space, but also ideologically. So in this paper in which those exchanges between Arthur Manuel and the Dene occurred was a list of resources that then development officer of the Dene Nation, Jorge Manuel, has set up for Dene people to read and access if they wanted, that might provide what he referred to as a development philosophy for the Dene Nation. And within that list of resources were extensive third world literature ranging from Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, Albert Memmi's The Colonizer and the Colonized, Regis Debray's Revolution Within the Revolution, and importantly, essays and literature on Julius Nyerere and Tanzania itself. So Ajama essays on socialism, Nyerere on freedom and socialism, and a whole host of other literatures. So rather than kind of this being the product of our assimilation into kind of the left, which was claimed by Harold Cardinal and both the federal government and the Assembly of the Northwest Territories, what I argue in this work was that we were immersed in a global anti-colonial conversation, which included not only ideational but material cross-fertilizations involved in these types of struggles and movements over time and space. And I wanted to end the conversation, which was written out beautifully in the paper that I had to offer, with reflections on how this resorts back to Edward Said's notions and thoughts on traveling theory. So aside from being, like I had said, or had lovingly referred to at the opening of this talk, it's of course my 43rd Wretched year revolving around this sun, but more importantly and seriously, it's also the 14th, or the anniversary of the 14th year that we no longer have Edward Said guiding us in his intellectual thought and his important work. So Said died in 2014, so I wanted to end with some reflections on his own thoughts on traveling theory, which kind of changed over his career. In 1984, he had a really kind of conservative or melancholic view of kind of the possibility of traveling through time and space, of adapting certain theories from other locales that may or may not have similar ideological and material conditions. And of course, his position on this was a reading of Lukash's classic History and Class Consciousness. And he kind of looked at how the reception of this text got brought up over time and saw a conservative stint or a conciliatory stint in the interpretation of Lukács's work. And then he changes his mind and produces 10 years later an essay called Traveling Theory Reconsidered. And what changed his mind was the reception, or his claimed reception of Lukács by Fanon. So he claims, and I think he's wrong on this, but that Fanon must have or could have been, he speculates, reading the first French edition of History and Class Consciousness, which was produced in France in 1969, when he was penning his own magnum opus, The Wretched of the Earth, and that how the reified world that Lukács demonstrates in History and Class Consciousness really comes to life in Fanon's depiction of the Manichaean world of racialized violence in The Wretched of the Earth. But instead of having a conciliatory sort of effect, it becomes even more militant in its oppositional sort of dialectical formulation, which gives Said a pause of breath to see and to open up kind of the idea on how theory can travel and radically mutate, in Nigel Gibson's own words, when it is moved from one place to another, adopted and borrowed from one people in other contexts and other places. So I want to end by just suggesting that the militant kind of cross-fertilizations that I'm talking here is a witness of a historical example of these cross-fertilizations and a deepening of these kind of materia and ideological commitments against colonialism and imperialism in ways that I think are relevant here and hopefully will become kind of, I haven't figured it out yet, but a foundation of a kind of a red and black foundation of a critique of settler colonial political economies that better understands the confluence of forces that produce these states and these economies, namely anti-blackness and the historical presence of slavery, dispossession, and genocide. So I'll leave it at that. Sorry, I forgot the last few pages. I wasn't lying.
We have about 20 minutes for questions, so we can get to as many as we can. We'll take 3 questions in a row before Glen responds to them. And we do have the room until 9 o'clock, so please do stick around. If we don't get to your question, you'll be able to speak to Glen directly.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It's real important that you acknowledge the African and the influence that the African people have had on the red people of North America. I have to mention Walter Rodney. You didn't mention his name. I thought that should be a really important aspect of your research as well, because he's done all this connection. Also, you mentioned African Canadian Rocky Jones, who passed away not very long ago, and his book just came out. That's a powerful connection as well. So I commend you on your work, and I'm looking forward to reading all your work. Thank you.
Just wanted to thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the critique of Quebecois settler colonialism that you referred to earlier, but didn't really have time to get into. I think it's a very interesting subject and kind of very fraught contradictions, the way that these different kind of anti-colonial discourses are taken up in different ways. So I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about that.
Yeah,
Just take one more question.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Also, thank you for your talk. I have a question about, so one of Fanon's concerns, or main concern, or like a big concern for him, were the nationalist bourgeoisie and like the colonized intellectual petty bourgeoisie. And I'm just wondering if you think that your present project, which I think is super exciting, is like an intervention into what Fanon was tracing back during sort of the Third World Liberation movements, that like the petty bourgeoisie intellectuals would steer through like sort of like a, I don't know, like a kind of cultural resurgence would steer the third world revolutionary societies back in towards like a, I guess, a first world kind of like capitalist society. And I'm just wondering if you see those dynamics playing out today in the indigenous resurgence in certain sort of like polls towards, I guess, a culturalist petty bourgeoisie. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I covered that pretty well in the first book, where it is a critique of, like, I distinguish myself a bit from Fanon on culture, and I think we have to be a little bit more contextual in understanding the meaning of culture in its both ideational and material sort of articulations. So I deal with some of that, and I think that critique and understanding how colonial formations can persist in formerly post-colonial sort of circumstances, and that will involve a reinvigoration of Fanonian insights, among others. The new stuff deals a little bit more with Marx's uptake and Mao's uptake in the Red Power movements that has been hitherto kind of really undiscussed because of some ideological pulls that occur between what's happening in places like here and then the trajectory in politics, which was often very anti-Marxist within AIM, like the American Indian movement. So all that stuff is like kind of working itself out. I don't know its direct, like its specific contours yet. Like I say, this is just a sketch, but it has a number of areas that need to be filled in. An important one, which kind of collapses this distinction that some have read, even my own work, making between a hard line between land and labor. I try and nuance that stuff through an examination in one chapter of the internationalist influences on people like Jorge Manuel, but predate like Maurice, Smallface, Marula, and their work in the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, and brings it back to indigenous militant labor organizing here on the North Shore, through its relationship with the Wobblies, and where indigenous labor was an expression of a defense of indigenous land rights, but done through labor because you couldn't organize as indigenous peoples yet until the 1950s. So doing some of that important work, which I think is a twin sort of foundation for like the internationalism of somebody like Manuel, and the idea of the fourth world is in this kind of long history of indigenous national internationalism, which this, like I tried to gesture towards in my introduction, which this place is really is an important exemplar moment in that bigger history. Thank you. Yeah, the Rodney example is great, and so is the Rocky Jones stuff. Super crucial in the story that I tell too, in situating what it was about Tanzania is important, specifically through. I've learned a lot from CLR James too, and his the 1969 preface to the history of Pan-African revolt, and then Robin Kelly's contextualization of that moment where Tanzania emerged as this beacon alongside, especially after Ghana had kind of fallen, alongside China in particular, but also Cuba and some of the Latin American contexts. So it is trying to really fill out these conversations that we've always historically had in order to come up with a better, more comprehensive understanding of the forces that are aligned against us, resulting in our continued erasure and genocide and so on. So thank you. What was the white people. Quebec. It collapsed, those critiques, like the external critiques of Vallier and like even Trudeau, or like sometimes something is so ridiculous that it doesn't even warrant serious consideration. But I think some of the Quebecois stuff does. Trudeau's critique of the Quebecois in that 1964 essay, Separatist Counter-Revolutionaries, is critiquing them by kind of warping Fanon's own critique of national bourgeoisie and applying it to them in order to defend a genocidal settler state. So it's like, there's not much there other than it's just fucking weird that conversation is even on historical record. There's like the idiosyncrasy of like Canadian federalist, separatist politics produced a weird brand of its own, like I said, colonial anxiety that played itself out in these public intellectual exchanges. But the Quebec as colonized sort of trope, even by those players over time, like Vallier, collapsed in on its own contradictions. So you had there's not even, like, we can give critiques like David Austin and Sean Mills and all these people who have written extensively on that in that kind of 60s moment. But they themselves came to recognize it as like, oh, we can't be making these claims like we were in 68. When you look at Quebec's relationship to Indigenous peoples or anti-blackness and anti-racism in Quebec, obviously right to this present. It's just an inappropriate framework to understand kind of the racial and economic dynamics of Quebec society. So that stuff is there in sections of this kind of introduction. But the contradictions actually do as much work as external critiques do. It imminently unfolded on its own whiteness in ways that that I just kind of that I note in the longer piece.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about kind of your methodology. I think you're changing what theory means, like as a term, like what it applies to, as using like Lee Miracle, like using literature, statements of declarations of independence. Are you expanding what theory means by looking at these various connections and these various like texts and textual sites, even like landscapes? And so what does traveling theory mean in that context? And that's just like what I'm gathering from it, but maybe theory needs to be limited as a word, and maybe other definitions, like literature might take another group of text and label it something else. Anyway, I'm just wondering about the expansion of the term.
Thanks for giving the talk. I'm reading your book right now as a PhD student at UBC at the Social Justice Institute, and I sort of have a question more about how your book applies, or how your written work manifests itself in your consciousness raising and teaching work. And my question is, when you're in those environments, you're teaching or consciousness raising in non-Indigenous spaces, what are some strategies that you use to navigate the line between essentialism and anti-essentialism as it applies maybe to theory in the case of teaching, but also culture in the sense of sort of activism and resurgence, how to not fall into the trappings of essentialism?
I'd like to ask a question about the influence of militant cross-fertilizations with Indigenous folks along the lines of the non-aligned nations, and how that might have created an influence around notions of autogestion, which is kind of a state-induced tincture to get rid of the state and to move away from capitalist production to notions of social wealth. So just how that might have been a traveling knowledge that got picked up and used in different contexts.
Yes. I think rather than do away with theory, I just think that we ought to recognize theory where it is being generated in a more open sort of sense. So in the book, I try and kind of understand theory that's actually like embedded in the social relationships of place and land, which have like generally not been understood of sites of critical sort of criticality, if you will. Like often, like one of the, and this is to be a bit crude, but like one of the attempts in much sort of normative theory is to abstract out of the messiness of place in order to come up with some sort of first principles through reason that aren't confused by that mess. And then our job on the ground is to best approximate those ideals. And it's not worked, and it always, Etienne Balibar actually does this, I think, in one of his essays in Equilibrium, says that gap, the hegemonic gap between ideal and practice in kind of liberal theory is something that sustains it over time. We can pat ourselves on the back saying we've got all the kind of, the principles right, we just haven't approximated it. Whereas it's actually always approximation that's our problem, and it feeds into narratives of kind of just foundations and all these sorts of things that settler nationalisms really gravitate around. Canada is ultimately just in terms of these principles. The US is ultimately just in these abstract principles. We just haven't, we've failed to approximate it in a sense. So we keep trying to reach that origin story that it's itself a fucking racist lie. So I think that like a practical ethics or theoretical framework that's like takes those relationships and spaces seriously as generators of critical knowledge is an important way to get out of that kind of myth that like kind of more normative liberal theorists tether themselves to, straitjacket themselves to. And you have your Marxists in that as well. Yes, literature, and I've learned this through kind of my indigenous feminist colleagues, like making me listen over and over and over again, is that the sites of big P politics is often are structured by like heterosexism and heteropatriarchy in ways that have created in the public record and historical narratives gaps, which just which suggest that they're not there, but they are there. They're just organizing in sites that aren't often the sites that are reserved for like straight men, even Native men. So you have to go to those sites of cultural production that have sustained this ongoing anti-colonial, anti-patriarchal sort of critique. So like Merkel's often like obviously had a footprint in both the big P politics, but also has been extraordinary in the cultural production of this critique sustained over time through her literature. So yes, I think that I'm trying to do that, to extend what political theory means to rightfully demonstrate that occurs in multiple sites and through multiple voices and in defense of a diversity of bodies and lands. Yeah, non-aligned. It's there, it will be there. Like some of that stuff it comes through, particularly the Tanzania example. But I'm still working on that. A lot of that actually connects, is expressed through the connection, like for instance, on like the language of self-reliance that and socialism that the Dene adopt, its relationship to Tanzania, and importantly, Tanzania's kind of important cross relationship with the People's Republic of China and Mao. So it's like I'm still working out. A lot of this is also not set or not written down anywhere. So it's kind of through archives and now emerging the importance of oral histories and stuff like that. But like still teasing that out for for the project.
We've got time for 3 more questions or comments, and the rooms will still be available, and Glenn will be around to take more questions.
Thanks, Glenn. I'm wondering if you can comment on some of the kind of more contemporary trajectories that these kinds of alliances and cross-fertilizations have taken. And for me, some things that come to mind, I see, Doreen is here somewhere, but, Arthur Manuel traveled to Tanzania after Jorge Manuel passed away and continued those relationships. Wolverine, as recently as the mid-2000s, was part of a delegation to the People's Republic of China, explicitly as a Shekwapmuk leader. Ray Bob was involved in founding the Third and Fourth World People's Alliance, which was very much connected to the non-aligned movement in terms of anti-imperialist movements here in the city and in these territories. And my understanding is that parallel to the Native study groups, shortly after, there was a Third World and Fourth World women's study group. And many of these elders are still in our communities, or are still with us, or still doing kick-ass work. And so I'm wondering if there's kind of contemporary trajectories of that work that you see happening today.
Absolutely, for all those reasons. And in our, like we've talked about too, there's also like, quote, Third and Fourth World hidden histories of solidarity that need to be explored, especially in places like this. So between kind of Fourth World activists and kind of militant Maoist crossovers within Indian liberation sort of nationalists. And you're right, that's why it's kind of, this has just been essentially what I've been doing over the last couple of years is trying to write a preface to a book that I wrote already by just jumping down rabbit holes and kind of following them out and letting that sort of messy or methodology sort of take me to different areas. And because of the lack of or the significant kind of dent in the public record on these sorts of things, and the way in which certain kind of relationships have already been predetermined through a kind of ahistorical look at these or just a by not looking at these relationships, means that there's actually not all that much that's there to look at unless you start getting into the archives of familial estates, or more importantly, talking to the people who were there on the ground fighting these battles out and supporting each other's struggles in the 60s and 70s. And gleaning from those voices, both text and actual voices, what's still very important about the critiques that germinated there and continue to live on through those lives.
Hi. So this is kind of a follow-up question to the question about Quebec. I've done a lot of activism in Quebec, and what I found really weird was even amongst the most progressive people in Quebec, there was still this idea of, like Quebec racism and colonialism on the part of Canada's state. I'm wondering or your thoughts on that, which you kind of touched on. And I'm wondering whether you would characterize the current Quebec separatist movement as a neo-colonial movement, or whether you think that there's a way to reconcile that movement with Indigenous sovereignty in Quebec.
That's cool. I don't really give it all that much thought. I would, in terms of, there is a narrative, the reconciling the two solitudes, this narrative of two founding peoples and Indigenous people. I've been on research groups that were progressive or left in its orientation, and Indigenous peoples kind of got played out. They were this pawn in this narrative between the Federalists and the Separatists, and it was part of the kind of pawn that they played was who's treated them better, and some sort of like ability to kind of like a self-congratulation on, depending on which argument was going down. It's like, no, it's better with us, say the Federalists. Oh, no, it's always been better with us, say the folks on the Quebec side. So Indigenous peoples then unfortunately played in that. And then there's a complicating role now that some of my Métis friends and scholars are doing, which is rooting into this kind of newfound indigenization of the Quebecois, which is kind of the adoption of Quebec as a Métis society and blah, 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 blah. And then the sort of more nationalist critique, which I think is correct, of that. So I kind of take it as a rule to not speak too much or blabber on about things that I don't know, but that I will a little bit, is that there's like some fucked up politics in Quebec over this, which I'm actually not going to get too into, unless it is in more in terms of like the best practices that are going on in Quebec in terms of anti-racist decolonial work that's linking these struggles in a productive way. But that's particularly within migrant justice movements and then anti-racist and Indigenous advocacy stuff. So,
Got time for one last question or comment.
It seems like part of your agenda might be fighting the essentialism of theory. Is that fair?
Again?
That part of your agendas might be to be fighting the essentialism of theory or the essentializing of theory.
I haven't really thought about that. I forgot I didn't answer the essentialism question. I'm not a big, essentialism isn't like I discussed in previous work, anti-essentialist claims or problems with essentialism usually have two fundamental kind of aspects to them. One is a empirical argument about the way that we are, our identities, collective or individual. They're just more hybrid and diverse than they are. But then there's usually some political or normative component to it. They say that this is good because it's more open, it challenges hierarchies that are defended on essentialist grounds and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, that's fine. When hierarchies are defended on these essentialist grounds, then normative anti-essentialism is important, but often there's also essentialist arguments which are grounded on self-understandings that have a liberatory thrust to them. So I don't think in that frame, essentialism is the boogeyman that we should be chasing. It's looking at the ways in which articulations of identity, collective or individual or whatever, are put to political use to affect certain ends. And that's often like what we're concerned with is various structural violences of sorts and these sorts of things. Aside from that, I'm not like how people identify and whether that's objectively correct or not is often none of my business. But when those are deployed in communities towards violent ends of sorts, then I think that interrogation and critique is important.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Glen, for that fascinating talk. We have the room until 9 o'clock. The bar is open until then as well. We look forward to perhaps doing the book launch here as well. And thank you very much for being here this evening.